All right, let's get into the news. As I mentioned, I wanted to start with this article from Time. It says it's the secret history of the shadow campaign that saved the 2020 election. And when I first saw this come across my, actually a number of you sent this to me, which is awesome. Thank you. It is, I was like, wait a minute, what, are they kidding us right now? We just got done with about 2 months of them telling us that there was no evidence of widespread voter fraud. Every single claim relating to voter fraud or any of the electoral integrity issues that Trump and his campaign lawyers were bringing up, all of that was baseless. Remember that word? And the sort of the narrative kept shifting around from, well, there's no evidence, that to there's no widespread evidence. Now everything is baseless. And we sort of were going through that progression in real time as we were responding to the daily news. And now it has sort of even morphed into something that's more dangerous. Now we see that all of this election disinformation was responsible for cultivating dangerous individuals. And that turned into insurrection, which stormed the Capitol, which was undermining American democracy. And many of us were saying, wait a minute, what? You know, how do you go from some people have questions about electoral integrity all the way to now they're dangerous insurrectionists who have to have their platforms, canceled, and they have to be investigated by the CIA, according to John Brennan and these other individuals who are now talking about, using insurgency tactics on local American citizens. We're all just scratching our heads here going, I think we're talking about two different things here, but okay. And so now when the story comes out, Time is saying, yeah, hey, by the way, there was a secret history. There was a shadow campaign that saved the 2020 election. All of us are going, yeah, we were. I'm not going to say I told you so. I can't do that here because of some of the rules now. But we're not going to say that. But this is the same stuff that we've been talking about. We've been sort of raising flags about this stuff for some time. So now that Time Magazine comes out and says, yeah, basically, you're right. I mean, there was all of this going on, and we're just going to talk about it out in the open. It seems very brazen, but I do want to go through it because if you haven't read this article, I would encourage you to read the whole thing. We're not going to read through the whole thing. I know some other shows are doing that. But I'm not going to do that here. What we're going to do is break this article up, and then I'm going to take you back through some of the other slides that we had covered previously when we were discussing litigation before the election took place on November 3rd and afterwards. And so go read the whole article because we're not going to read the whole thing here, but I am going to flip through a couple things, and I want to make some points. So they start off this article by saying, a strange thing happened on November 3rd. It wasn't the meltdown of the country. They're saying a second odd thing happened amid Trump's attempts to reverse the result. Corporate America turned on him. And so this is where the cabal kind of starts. Hundreds of major business leaders, many of whom backed Trump before, called on him to concede. The president felt amiss. He said on December 2nd, it all was very, very strange. Within days after the election, we witnessed an orchestrated effort to anoint the winner, even while many states were still being counted. Yeah, and we all noticed that too, right? We saw that on election night. We saw Fox News calling Arizona. We saw other states saying the votes weren't being counted yet. We saw these big spikes in voting, and the whole thing just felt like it was already decided before it was actually over. And now, as we're going to find out, there was a point to that. And so they say when, Donald Trump was saying, well, in a way, Trump was right. There was a conspiracy. This is from the Time magazine, okay? There was a conspiracy unfolding behind the scenes, one that curtailed the protest and coordinated the resistance from CEOs. Both surprises were the result of an informal alliance between left-wing activists and business titans. The pact was formalized in a terse, little-noticed joint statement of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is supposed to be typically a Republican-ish organization, and this AFL-CIO, which is the big labor union. They published this on Election Day. Both sides would come to see it as a sort of implicit bargain inspired by the summer's massive, sometimes destructive, racial justice protests in which forces of labor came together with forces at Capitol to keep peace and oppose Trump's assault on democracy. And so, this goes on. I wanted to point out a couple other things before we take a look at what voter suppression is, because we're going to see that a lot of this activity, a lot of what they're talking about here is about fortifying the election. Everything that was done, all of this massive organization, this cabal, this secret campaign that they use in their title is this orchestration between big capital, big labor. They're coming together to depose a dictator who goes by the name of Donald Trump. Why did they do that? It's to fortify America. They weren't colluding to undermine democracy. They had to do it to save democracy. You understand this? And this is where they're justifying it. They say their work touched every aspect of the election. They got states to change voting systems. Well, we talked about this. We talked about all the lawsuits where they were filing the lawsuits to change them. They changed the voting system and the laws, and they helped secure hundreds of millions in public and private funding. They fended off voter suppression lawsuits. We're going to revisit voter suppression because a lot of this is stemming around voter suppression. They recruited armies of poll workers. They got millions of people to vote by mail for the first time, all under the guise of preventing voter suppression. They successfully pressured social media companies. We've got some examples of that to take a harder line against what they're calling disinformation, but that's their definition of disinformation. They used data-driven strategies to fight viral smears. Whole campaign, we saw this executed on a daily basis on all of the platforms. They executed a national public awareness campaign that helped Americans understand how to vote. They were preventing Trump's conspiracy theories and false claims of victories from getting more traction after Election Day. They monitored every pressure point to ensure that Trump could not overturn the result. The untold story of the election is the thousands of people of both parties who accomplished a triumph of American democracy at its very foundation, said Norm Eilson, a prominent lawyer who worked on this voter protection program. And so my question here was, okay, so we all were sort of experiencing this in real time. We were all looking around and saying, that's weird. The media seems like they're colluding with big tech. That seems like they're colluding with a lot of these other organizations. I was looking at it from a legal perspective. I went through, 15 different lawsuits before the election even occurred, and a lot of the litigation surrounding it. And we were asking the same question here. Well, are we going to get any idea on what's going on? Where are the Republicans? Where are their arguments? I said for a long time that the Republicans were legally asleep at the wheel. The Democrats were just running roughshod over them in all of their pre-election litigation. Some of these cases went up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court just kind of smacked them back down. And we were saying on the show before the election, this is going to be a problem, by the way. If it's a close election, this is going to be a problem. And now we're finding out that behind the scenes, all of these organizations were working together. And so I'm thinking to myself, all right, well, that's a little bit strange. Why would they come out and start discussing this stuff? Why would they reveal their secret? Why would they sort of open up the recipe book and show us what the secret sauce is made of? Because they can just continue to execute this moving forward. And they explain it in this article. They say that's why the participants want the secret history of the 2020 election told. Even though it sounds like a paranoid fever dream, a well-funded cabal of powerful people ranging across industries and ideologies working together behind the scenes to influence perceptions, change rules and laws, steer media coverage, and control the flow of information. They were not rigging the election, they were fortifying it. And they believe the public needs to understand the system's fragility in order to ensure that American democracy endures. All right. So it literally just, hey, we did it in order to save America, not to undermine America. So change the rules, change the law, control the flow of information. This is their language. I'm reading from it. Steer the media coverage, work together behind the scenes to influence perceptions. That's you. They're trying to influence you. They're trying to control the flow of information to you. They're trying to control the media coverage that you're seeing. And if that doesn't work, they're going to change the rules and change the laws by their own admissions in their own document. And it's all stemming around this idea of voter suppression. We talked about this before the election took place. What is voter suppression? Per Wikipedia, voter suppression is a strategy that's used to influence the outcome of an election by discouraging or preventing specific groups of people from voting. And now the Democrats use this very regularly. They say, we have to get a lot of people to come out and vote. And they give us a lot of examples of what voter suppression looks like. Here's 61 examples over by the Voting Rights Alliance. And when we were talking about this during the election, look at all this stuff. Basically, anything and everything is voter suppression, everything. And when you sort of operate by a playbook in this manner, you can just sort of use a buzzword to accomplish anything that you want if you can define everything to fall under the umbrella of the buzzword. And so voter suppression is literally everything. It's basically anything that's relating to voting, and they can have it both ways. And take a look at some of these examples. So we've got, tough deputy registrar requirements. We've got no Sunday souls at the polls, early voting cuts, no early voting, strict voter ID laws, closing DMVs and strict voter ID states, polling place relocations, reductions of polling place, inadequate or poorly trained staff. It goes on and on and on. Use of suspense lists or suspend lists, absentee ballot short return deadlines, voter caging, partisan gerrymandering, police at polling stations, proof of citizenship laws, excessive voter purging, clearing out the voter rolls, refusal to place polling sites on college campuses is voter suppression. Everything is voter suppression. And so if you say that now, you sort of have this political cover. You can go in and basically do anything that you want. And you just say, look, well, we're doing this because we want the right to vote. We want voter enfranchisement. We want everybody to come out to vote. And you say, well, but we think we should check their IDs, for example. And they say, what? Excuse me? That's voter suppression, okay? We've identified that from the Voting Rights Alliance. You're a voter suppressor, and you're probably a racist as well, because typically people want to depress other minorities from voting. Well, what if the police go to a polling station? That's voter suppression. What if we want to just make sure that you're a citizen before you go and cast a vote? Voter suppression. You see how this works? And so they can just get anything passed under this woke political guise because everybody now has to kowtow to that and say, you're right, I'm not a racist, go do whatever the hell you want. And this has been happening this entire election season. Everything has been based under voter suppression. And we talked about this, and this is something that both political sides do, by the way. Now, the Democrats are out there, they're now revealing this, that there was this entire cabal. It was their own shadow campaign by their own admission. They were the ones responsible for it, so I'm talking it in their regard. I would be extremely pissed if the Republicans were doing the same thing, controlling the information that we get, because you're too stupid to understand what's going on in the world. They have to tell us. They got to put context boxes, and they have to make sure that everything's censored for us, because we as the American people are just so dumb that we can't figure it out on our own. And if the Republicans were competent, which they're not, then they would probably try to do the same thing. But they're just in a whole different ballgame. They're playing Little League. The Democrats are playing in the Super Bowl. It's a joke. And both sides would do it if they can. And here's what the arguments typically look like. So this is another document, another slide that we went through, I think before, right after the election. And when we're talking about the difference between voter suppression and voter fraud and the right to vote and election integrity, this is typically how it works. If you are a person who thinks that vote quality is more important or higher prioritized than the quantity of the votes, then you are going to be in this top row. You're somebody who thinks that the quality of the vote is more important than the high number of votes. And if you are in that category and you're a Democrat, they're going to say that you are somebody who believes in voter suppression, okay, because you don't want people to come out and vote. So this is the pejorative term. This is bad. You are a vote suppressioner. Not good. If you're a Republican and you are in this category, how do you identify yourselves? Well, you say, no, it's not voter suppression. This is election integrity, folks. We want to make sure that the people who are supposed to be voting are the ones voting, that we don't have a bunch of fake ballots. We don't have vans delivering them behind the stadium in the middle of the night after the voting deadline happened. You want to say, we want to make sure you're a citizen. We want to make sure that you are registered to vote. You're not voting out of state. You're not voting twice. Let's see your ID to make sure you are who you say you are. That's all election integrity. So the Republicans will favor that, and they'll use, maybe, we haven't seen it in this last election, but they could use some suppression votes and manipulate this, right? They could have very strict rules in certain locations that would in fact suppress the votes, and they might have a higher quality of votes. They may be able to verify that every single person who did vote at that time was entitled to vote, but you might get a big swath of people who don't vote who were eligible to vote because of that voter suppression. That's the Democrats' argument for how that works. Now, if you flip that, so if you turn that upside down and you say, well, we don't really care about the quality of the votes. We just want as many people to vote as possible. We don't want to disenfranchise people at all. And I agree with that, right? We don't want people who are eligible and capable of voting to not go and vote. This is America. We want people to go out and vote. If they are not able to do that, then they shouldn't be voting. If they're not legally qualified to vote, then they shouldn't be voting. But here's what that looks like. Here's what this argument looks like. So they're saying we want more people voting, even if it means we get some bad votes in there. They're calling it the right to vote. Republicans, by contrast, call it voter fraud. So you can just sort of see if it favors the Republicans, they're going to call it election integrity. If it's going to favor the Democrats, they're going to call it voter suppression. When Republicans call it election integrity, Dems call it voter suppression. When Republicans call it voter fraud, Democrats call it the right to vote. So we're talking about the same two issues, but both parties are just manipulating it for marketing purposes, right? They have their little spin on it. Now that we know how this works, this is what they're talking about here. They're using a lot of these concepts in their entire plan. So let's go back to the Times article. Who was the person responsible for this cabal? Who led this entire shadow campaign? It's this guy, Mike Podhorser, who was getting started in this in the fall of 2019. He became convinced that the election was headed for disaster, and he was determined to protect it. Not win it, not manipulate it, not fraudulently induce it, not ensure a Biden victory, only to protect it. Got it right. This was not his usual purview. For nearly a quarter century, he was a senior advisor for the AFL-CIO, the largest union federation. He used the tactics to help its favorite candidates win elections. Unassuming and professorial, he isn't the hair gel political strategist. Among Democratic insiders, he's known as the wizard behind some of the biggest advances in political technology in recent decades. A group of liberal strategists he brought together in early 2000s led to the creation of the Analyst Institute, a secretive firm that applies scientific methods to political campaigns. He was also involved in the founding of Catalyst, the flagship progressive data company. So that's this guy right here, Mike Podhorser, and they created this alliance. Back in November, a potential for a meltdown was obvious. In his apartment in the D.C. suburbs, Podhorser began working from his laptop at his kitchen table, holding back-to-back Zoom meetings for hours a day with his network of contacts in the progressive universe. So he wasn't, conversing with Republicans, right? Republicans were going to destroy America. He's going to save it. The labor movement was a part of this cabal, this alliance. The institutional left, like Planned Parenthood, Greenpeace, resistance groups like Indivisible, Move On, progressive data geeks and strategists, representatives of donors and foundations, state-level grassroots organizers, racial justice advocates, and others. They created the cabal, the secret alliance. The meetings became the galactic center for a constellation of operatives across the left who shared overlapping goals but didn't usually work in the concrete. The group had no name, no leaders, no hierarchy. Pod played a critical behind-the-scenes role in keeping different pieces of the government together and the infrastructure and communication aligned. You have and here's where this is exactly what we were talking about. Quote, you have the litigation space, the organizing space. The political people just focused on the win, and their strategies aren't always aligned. He allowed this ecosystem to work together. And we talked all about the legal space, the litigation space. This group of attorneys, this group of lawyers, many of them were led by Mark Elias, the person we talked about yesterday, I think it was, sort of the powerhouse litigation manager for the Democrats. And what did they do? How did they organize all of this? We talked about it before the election happened. Do you remember the Alliance for Retired Americans? This was a slide that we clipped from their website, and you can see the address right there. The retiredamericans.org, Pennsylvania Supreme Court rules in favor of retiree demands for mail-in ballots. This was all taking place before the election. And here's what it says. The Alliance for Retired Americans, working with its state chapters, has filed lawsuits to protect vote by mail and absentee voters in where? Florida, Maine, Michigan, Minnesota, North Carolina, Texas, Wisconsin, in addition to Pennsylvania. The lawsuit is supported by Priorities USA, which if you are familiar with politics, they have a lot of money. They raise a lot of funds for liberal causes. And this is what the diagram looks like. Priorities USA provided the funding to the Alliance for Retired Americans, and they drafted and submitted lawsuits in all of these different states. And look, there's some pretty important ones. Florida, Michigan, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. Okay, they thought that they were going to flip Texas. The biggest battleground states, this was just one component of their litigation, and we talked about it here. This is not to mention anything else that they were talking about. The organizing space, the get out the vote, the media space, the social media space. We're going to get into all of it. Securing the vote. The first task for this cabal, this shadow campaign, was overhauling America's bulky election infrastructure in the middle of a pandemic. Remember, we talked a lot about that as well. COVID, grandma, poor COVID, because grandma's not going to be able to go and vote. For the thousands of local, mostly nonpartisan officials who administer elections, the most urgent need was money. They needed protective equipment. They needed to pay for postcards, letting people know they could vote absentee or vote by mail to every voter. They needed additional scanners and staff to process ballots. But in March, activists appealed to Congress to steer COVID relief money to election administration. I'd like to know more about that. How did that money get steered to election administration? Who's responsible for that? What activists appealed to Congress, and what Congress leaders shifted COVID relief money, which should have gone to COVID relief, to election administration? Led by the Leadership Conference on the Civil and Human Rights, more than 150 organizations signed a letter to every member of Congress seeking $2 billion in election funding. It was somewhat successful. The CARES Act passed later that month, containing $400 million in grants to state election administrators, but the next tranche of relief funding didn't add to that number. It wasn't going to be enough. Who was responsible for that? I don't know. It sounds like there are answers for that. Private philanthropy then stepped in. An assortment of foundations contributed tens of millions in election administration funding. We talked about this too on the show. $300 million came in from the Chan Zuckerberg initiative. Quote, it was a failure at the federal level that 2,500 local election officials were forced to apply for philanthropic grants to fill their needs. Zuckerberg had the money, came up $300 million. There's a different story. I'm not sure that I clipped it, where I think Zuckerberg actually invited people over to his house and they had conversations about this and what to do. Yeah, this is where we get into the disinformation defense. Laura Quinn, a veteran progressive operative who co-founded Catalyst, began studying the problem. She piloted a nameless secret project, which she has never before publicly discussed. They tracked disinformation online, and then they tried to figure out how to combat it. One component was tracking dangerous lies that might otherwise spread unnoticed. Researchers then provided information to campaigners and media to track down the sources and expose them. The solution, she concluded, was to pressure platforms to enforce their rules, both by removing content or accounts that spread disinformation, by more aggressively policing it in the first place. Basically just telling them to delete your stuff, deplatform you, cancel you. And this was an operation to do that. We see here where Zuckerberg invited nine civil rights individuals over to his house. Quinn researched they gave ammunition to advocates pushing social media platforms to take a harder line. In November 2019, Zuckerberg invited 9 civil rights leaders to dinner at his home, where they warned him about the danger of election-related falsehoods that were already spreading unchecked. Quote, it took pushing, urging, conversations, brainstorming, all of that to get to a place where we ended up with more rigorous rules and enforcement, said the CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil Human Rights. She attended the dinner. She also met with Jack Dorsey and others. Gupta has now since been nominated for Associate Attorney General by Biden. So she's campaigning to win the election, and then he's going to nominate her to the Associate Attorney General position. It's a nice little quid pro Joe, isn't it? It was a struggle, but we got to the point where they understood the problem. Was it enough? Probably not. Was it later than we wanted? Yes, but it's really important, given the level of official disinformation, that they had those rules in place and were tagging things and taking them down. What is she talking about? Well, you remember this? This claim about election fraud disputed. That was just one of a million different versions of this we saw. There were a lot of these. This has been contested, not officially decided, not accurate, whatever it was. Every time Trump said something, they had a new contextual tag. This was posted over from the MRC. The tech company censored Trump more than Biden. No kidding me. From May 31st, 2018 to 11/9/2020, Trump was censored 111 times. Biden, 0 times, right? Because of the cabal, the shadow campaign, the secret organization that was installing asterisk Joe Biden was responsible for this censorship. They had an intention here. They executed it. That's not my opinion. They're saying it. Spreading the word is another thing that they were trying to get into. The Voting Rights Lab and Into Action created state-specific memes, which is illegal. The DOJ arrested somebody for memes in 2016. Illegal memes. They spread by email, text, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. They urged that every vote be counted. Together, they were viewed more than 1 billion times. Protect Democracy's election task force issued reports and held media briefings with high-profile experts across the political spectrum, resulting in widespread coverage of potential election issues and fact-checking of Trump's false claims. The organization's tracking polls found that the message was being heard. The percent of the public that didn't expect to know the winner on election night gradually rose until by late October it was over 70%. So they were just spamming everybody and saying this was not going to be settled on the night, on November 3rd. We knew exactly what Trump was going to do. He was going to try to use the fact that Democrats voted by mail and Republicans voted in person to make it look like he was ahead, claim victory, say the mail-in votes were fraudulent, and try to get him thrown out. Setting public expectations ahead of time helped undercut those lies. So they just were doing a little bit of what's called persuasion. They were setting the table. They wanted everybody to think exactly what their strategy was going to play out in front of them, and it did. It had a lot of money, a lot of resources to do it. 1 billion times this stuff was viewed in an American election. It's a lot of times. Presumably, they're not advertising to the rest of the world. And the media fell right into place. This came over from the Daily Caller. We talked about this back on November 9th. Trump's press secretary was out there. Fox News cut them off. Fox News cuts away from the Trump campaign press conference with Neil Cavuto saying they can't in good countenance continue showing this when press secretary says the Democrats are welcoming fraud. Cut her off. Twitter also gives it a little hashtag there. Took that screenshot back. Probably right on November 9th. So they cut her off. Actually, I think we have that clip.
One party in America that opposes verifying signatures, citizenship, residency, eligibility. There is only one party in America trying to keep observers out of the count room. And that party, my friends, is the Democrat Party. You don't take these positions because you want an honest election. You don't oppose an audit of the vote because you want an accurate count. You don't oppose our efforts at sunlight and transparency because you have nothing to hide. You take these positions because you are welcoming fraud and you are welcoming illegal voting. Our position is clear. We want to protect the franchise of the American people. We want an honest, accurate, lawful count. We want maximum sunlight. We want maximum transparency. We want every legal vote to be counted, and we want every illegal vote to be...
Well, I just think we have to be very clear. She's charging, the other side is welcoming fraud and welcoming illegal voting. Unless she has more details to back that up, I can't in good countenance continue showing you this. I want to make sure that maybe they do have something to back that up, but that's an explosive charge to make, that the other side is effectively rigging and cheating. If she does bring proof of that, of course, we'll take you back. So far, she...
All right, so he's sort of right and he's wrong on that, right? So they didn't fraudulently steal illegal votes. They just changed the rules in order to better serve their side. So this document itself says that it was rigged, right? We just read that. So is this enough evidence for Neil Cavuto? He's going to come back and now talk about this. Oh yeah, hey, by the way, Trump kind of had a point there. My bad. Is that going to happen? I'm doubting it. People power. The summer uprising had shown that people power could have a massive impact. Activists began preparing to reprise the demonstrations if Trump tried to steal the election. Americans plan widespread protest if Trump interferes with the election, Reuters reported in October. More than 150 liberal groups, from the Women's March to the Sierra Club to the Color of Change, from Democrats.com to the Democratic Socialists of America, joined the, quote, Protect the Results Coalition. The group's now defunct website had a map listing 400 planned post-election demonstrations to be activated via text message as soon as November 4th to stop the coup they feared. The left was ready to flood the streets. I'm sure that would have all been very peaceful, though. Very peaceful. Nothing wrong about that at all. Were there Antifa people in there? Were there any unsavory individuals there? Was any of this stuff being investigated by anybody? No, of course not. Strange bedfellows. Who was working together on this? Were there any Republicans who were joining in? Yeah, there were. The Chamber of Commerce. We already talked about it. About a week before, Podhorzer received an unexpected message. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce wanted to talk. Behind the scenes, the business community was engaged in its own anxious discussions about how the election and its aftermath might unfold. The summer's racial justice protest, which we covered, had sent a signal to business owners too, the potential for economy-disrupting civil disorder. It's a reasonable threat, given the fact that they had 150 liberal groups and 400 planned post-election demonstrations. Yeah, it could have been some serious civil disorder. They were ready to go at the drop of a button, a text message. They were ready to mobilize. With tensions running high, there was a lot of concern about unrest around the election. Our breakdown in the normal way we handle contentious elections, said Neil Bradley, the Chamber's executive vice president and chief policy officer. These worries had led the Chamber to release a pre-election statement with the Business Roundtable, as well as others, calling for patience and confidence as the votes were counted. Then that statement, that strange bedfellow statement, was released on Election Day under the names of the Chambers Commerce CEO and the AFL-CIO president, Richard Trumka, the heads of the National Association of Evangelicals, the National African American Clergy Network, and it said here, it is imperative that election officials be given the space and time to count every vote in accordance with applicable laws. We call on the media, the candidates, and the American people to exercise patience with the process and trust in our system, even if it requires more time than usual. Although we may not always agree on the desired outcomes up and down the ballot, we are all united in our call for the American democratic process to proceed without violence, intimidation, or any other tactic that makes us weaker as a nation. So a very nice, very benevolent statement. Showing up and standing down, a next section. The conversation that followed was a difficult one, led by activists charged with the protest strategy. We want to be mindful of when was the right time to call for moving masses of people into the street. Looks like they're on a trigger, hair trigger. As much as they were eager to mount a show of strength, mobilizing immediately could backfire and put people at risk. Protests evolved into violent clashes. Trump would use it as a pretext to send in federal agents or troops, as he had over the summer. Rather than elevate Trump's complaints by continuing to fight him, they wanted to send the message that the people had spoken. So the word went out, stand down, protect the results, announced that it would not be activating the entire national mobilization network today, but remains ready to activate if necessary. On Twitter, outraged progressives wondered what's going on. Why wasn't anyone trying to stop Trump's coup? Where were all the protests? Podhorzer credits the activists for their restraint. They had spent so much time getting ready to hit the streets on Wednesday, but they did it. Wednesday through Friday, there was not a single Antifa versus Proud Boy incident like everyone was expecting. And when that did materialize, I don't think the Trump campaign had a backup plan. This is the last slide I want to cover, and then we're going to switch gears. In Podhorzer's presentation, winning the vote was only the first step to winning the election. After that came winning the count. So you got to win the vote, number one. You got to win the count, number two. You got to win the certification, number three. You got to win the electoral college, number four. Then you got to win the transition, number five. Right? And we went through all of this. Steps that are normally formalities, Trump would see as opportunities for disruption. So the Democracy Defenders, which is probably a new movie coming out on Marvel Disney soon, launched a full court press, protect democracy's local contacts, research the lawmakers' personal and political motives. Issue 1 ran television ads in Lansing, Michigan. The Chambers Bradley kept close tabs on the process. Wamp, the former Republican congressman, called his former colleague Mike Rogers. They wrote op-eds. 3 former governors from Michigan, John Engler, Rick Snyder, Democrat Jan Granholm, jointly called for Michigan's electoral votes to be free from the pressure from the White House. Engler, a former head of the Business Roundtable, made phone calls to influential donors and fellow GOP statesmen who could press the lawmakers privately. They were giving Trump a ton of grief over this, over phone calls, saying he's unduly pressuring people to vote one way or the other, and they're doing the exact same thing from the other end. They're doing it to protect democracy. Trump's doing it to defraud America. They're doing it to fortify the election. Aren't we just so lucky we have them in charge? They just care about us and American democracy. The members of the Alliance to Protect the Election have gone their separate ways. This is the last paragraph. The Democracy Defense Coalition has been disbanded. Though the fight back table lives on, Protect Democracy and the good government advocates have turned their attention to pressing reforms in Congress now. Left-wing activists are newly empowered. Civil rights groups are on guard against further attacks. Business leaders denounce the January 6th attack. And some say they will no longer donate to lawmakers who refuse to certify Biden's election. Podhorzer and his allies are still holding their Zoom strategy sessions, gauging voters' views and developing new messages. Trump is in Florida, facing his second impeachment, deprived of Twitter that he used to push the nation to its breaking point. Oh, wow. Well, folks, we came close to disaster. Thankfully, though, we had this secret campaign, this cabal of intellectuals, people who know more than we do about America. They know, what stories they can share. I'm very grateful that more Americans, didn't hear about Hunter Biden, for example. That was whitewashed by the media, whitewashed by social media as well. Not allowed to talk about any of that stuff, which is a good thing because it would have probably would have dissuaded a lot of stupid idiot Americans to maybe consider voting for someone else. And we don't want that to happen. We don't want those dummies out there to get disinformation. So we're just going to, set up this war room, and we're going to seize all of the different institutions of power. We're going to have the lawyers go in and change the rules. We're going to have the media make sure that they have the cover. We're going to make sure social media doesn't support our opponents. We're going to make sure we have enough boots on the ground. We're going to make sure we got enough money to fund this all by our own government for election integrity, for the right to vote. Because if you don't support any of this, you're killing grandma. COVID's going to kill everybody. So we got to make sure that the rules are manipulated. And we got to get government funding to do it. All of these changes, or a large part of them, they were either funded by Zuckerberg, some other private philanthropist, if you want to call him that, and you, the American people. Your tax dollars. And they just ran hog wild with it, and it worked. And they're just admitting it right out in the open now.